Warning, this episode contains graphic descriptions of the assassination of JFK. Discretion is advised. Who do you think killed JFK?
JFK was killed by one crazy guy with a magic bullet and a wild hair across his ass.
Lee Harvey Oswald.
Russians. Definitely Russians.
Lyndon Johnson, the CIA, or the mob. Take your pick.
Castro and those slimy fucking Russians.
I blame everything on the government.
Government?
The friggin' Cubans.
You might think it was the mafia or the Irish mob.
So I believe the CIA had played a huge part in the assassination of JFK.
The CIA.
The CIA.
Not Oswald.
Welcome to the Stranger Than Fiction podcast. I'm Chase.
And I'm Adam. Joining us on this episode is a very special guest. We've got with us Miles Mall. He is a paralegal and soon-to-be lawyer. Thanks for joining us, Miles.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
We'll see, I'm 33, husband of one, father of three, graduating from Purdue. Well, I mean, I'm not Mormon. I mean, so just I figure it's a good distinction.
Yeah, it's nice to clarify.
But yeah, that's really about it anymore. Going full-time pre-law, full-time legal assistant, and full-time family doesn't leave very much time for much else.
And full-time conspiracy nut?
Well, yeah, I mean,
or just part-time?
It's more of a part-time thing these days.
Okay.
Nobody's a full-time conspiracy nut.
I don't know.
As we'll find out tonight, maybe. Chase might be taking the night off. So this episode's topic is JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and his assassination. So John F. Kennedy was born on May 29th, 1917. He had a pretty large family and ultimately went to Harvard.
Harvard.
Yeah, exactly. And Stanford. He was born in Massachusetts, and ultimately he got into government. He served in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate before he was elected president in 1961. He was the 35th president. He was the youngest president ever elected. I think he was 43.
Yep, 43. And
when he was elected in 1961, or actually elected in 1960, but inaugurated in 1961. In the 1960s, there was a lot going on, particularly with foreign affairs and foreign crises. It was the middle of the Cold War, but he was arguably able to overcome a lot of these challenges and achieve quite a bit. He had a heavy hand in the establishment of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was a pretty significant accord, the first step towards nuclear control of nuclear weapons on a larger scale. This was a pact between the U.S., Russia, and Great Britain that basically said they wouldn't test nuclear bombs in space, underwater, or in the atmosphere. He was also a architect for the Alliance for Progress, which was a pretty significant improvement between economic relationship between the U.S. and Latin America. And he also established the Peace Corps, which obviously is still in place today. One of the most significant things that happened during his presidency was a pretty large clusterfuck known as the Bay of Pigs. Do you know a lot about the Bay of Pigs, guys?
I know pigs make bacon.
Yes, they do. And ham.
Or they don't actually make bacon, I guess, but they produce from their loins. No, I mean, outside of the Bay of Pigs being a complete clusterfuck, I think that's what everybody knows the Bay of Pigs as, right?
As a big clusterfuck?
A massive clusterfuck.
Yeah. Basically, this thing was kind of in progress a little bit before Kennedy took office. So President Eisenhower, he worked out with the CIA basically this plan to train a kind of guerrilla or rebel type army made of Cuban exiles with the goal of overthrowing Fidel Castro in Cuba. When Kennedy assumed the presidency, he basically inherited this plan, and he was pretty vocal that he didn't think it was a very good plan. He didn't want America to be so directly and overtly, in military action in Cuba because they were a communist country and buddies with Russia. So Kennedy believed, among a lot of other people, that instigating something with Cuba would piss off the Russians and potentially lead to World War III. But the CIA convinced Kennedy that they could conduct the mission secretly and without exposing American government's involvement. So that's exactly how it went, right? It stayed secret?
No. I mean, so this became the guerrillas basically versus the Cuban army or military. And come to find out, the Cuban military is scrappy as fuck and defeated these guerrilla warfare type whatever the hell they ended. I don't even know what we call them actually. I mean, is it our military? It's not considered our military, right? They're guerrilla fighters from Cuba, or guerrilla fighters from around the world, or guerrilla fighters from the United States. I don't know, but
they were guerrilla fighters, Cuban exiles.
So let's be clear though, they're not actual guerrillas.
Correct. They're chimpanzees.
No, but I mean, it's amazing that we trained and we did so many studies, it sounds like, and the CIA did so much testing and said, yeah, we can train this guerrilla army. And then come to find out, the Cubans can just destroy shit and they don't even tell people about it until they need to, and then they just do it.
Right, so the guerrilla army got their asses handed to them pretty quickly by the Cuban troops, and the CIA, kind of during this slaughter, called for Kennedy to help them out, send in some air support, and kind of back up these Cuban guerrillas. And he pretty much stood his ground and refused to provide any aid. And again, believing intervention and a really overt American action would lead to World War III. And I think the whole operation was over in about a day, and over 100 people died, and quite a few were taken hostage.
Yeah, I was going to say a bunch of hostages too.
Exactly. So ultimately, the CIA blamed Kennedy for the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, basically saying that he didn't have their backs, he was unwilling to provide them backup, and in public, Kennedy took responsibility for the failure, but he was quoted to saying some of his advisors that he was going to take the CIA, break it into 1,000 pieces, and cast the pieces into the wind.
Yeah, he was not I think both, publicly and not publicly, he was not a huge fan of the CIA. I mean, he despised secrets. He despised the way that they operated. He despised their operations. I mean, he was not a huge fan of the CIA any way you throw it. And I don't think the Bay of Pigs was the determining factor for his hatred or his dislike. I think it was just a extenuating circumstance that put the cherry on top of all of this.
Yeah, it didn't help anything. You have any other special nuggets you want to add about the Bay of Pigs, Miles?
No. Other than its failure and the animosity, which you guys covered pretty well there. But it created a whole lot of animosity, which was very well known.
Right, and potentially kind of leads to some things we'll talk about a little bit later. So that's why we're kind of wanted to bring it up here, because it's a foundation for some of the theories that exist about his assassination. So some other things that I wanted to touch on in the 1960s. One of the other big issue was racial tension. So during this time, you had the March on Washington, Martin Luther King, his I Have a Dream speech, and there was a poll that I saw about 50% of Americans believed that Kennedy was pushing racial integration too soon, and he had another major milestone kind of act that he had a good part in. He didn't actually see it put into place, was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was an important act that basically outlawed employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, and sex. So that was a pretty groundbreaking piece of legislation. JFK actually had the highest average approval rating of any president, and that still stands today, even though the approval ratings didn't start till 1920s, but still, I think a relevant point. This guy was beloved, and he was a very, very prominent figure in society and in popular culture as well.
Yeah, I mean, you can talk to any person of that generation. Basically, our parents, if they were well older than the average for our generation, or our grandparents. I mean, my grandmother would claim to have, it was that generation's defining moment. You knew where you were when it first came over. Many claim to cry. He was a very, very loved president.
Are you talking about when he died, or when he was elected president?
Well, when he died.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I'm jumping ahead. See, look at me.
So yeah, that's some good foreshadowing and segue. So yes, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. He died.
What?
Oh, this is like when the Titanic was spoiled.
I got to do my research.
Exactly. What are you doing here, Chase? But in Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy was taking part in a 10-mile motorcade. He was sitting in the back of a convertible. A lot of people have probably seen pictures or video clips of this event.
How many people? This goes back to our last episode of Mandela Effect. How many people were in the convertible when Kennedy got assassinated?
In the convertible?
In the convertible.
4, and then 5 if you count the guy riding on the bumper right afterwards.
That would be wrong. And we can now loop back right to the Mandela Effect and say 6. But continue on. 7 if you're including the guy on the bumper. But again, hashtag Mandela Effect.
So to quote you from the last episode, you're just going to light that shit can, kick it, and run away?
Well, I mean, there's nothing else to say on that. I'm not lighting any. I think I said shit bag.
Okay.
But I'm not lighting anything. I mean, most people there's a part of the Mandela Effect, and I don't think we need to go into it too deep because I don't want to turn this into a Mandela Effect episode. But there is a portion of the population, obviously both of you guys, that think that there was 4 people in the car. Kennedy and his wife, and then a driver and in the passenger seat, and that is not the case. There was actually 6 people.
Oh yeah, it was the governor. The governor and his wife were in there too.
Yeah, it's a big fucking car with 2, seemingly I think Secret Service agents in between the drivers and the Kennedys. So just a little tidbit, that's all.
But anyway, whether there's 2 people in the car, 10 people, 50 people in the car, the point is the car was driving as part of a motorcade, and there were shots fired. Kennedy was wounded, ultimately died from the gunshot wounds. The governor of Texas that we were just referencing was also injured in this shooting. And the official story is that these shots were all fired by a guy named Lee Harvey Oswald, who was up on the 6th floor of a nearby building. And Kennedy was pronounced dead about 30 minutes later after he was shot. And he was 46 years old. Lee Harvey Oswald, the guy, again, that officially, per the official story, shot President Kennedy, was arrested that same day. A little bit later, after he killed a police officer who tried to detain him, he was arraigned on both murders on the next day, November 23rd. And Oswald never went to court because he was killed 2 days after he killed Kennedy by a mobster named Jack Ruby.
Mobster?
I don't think you can call him a mobster.
He's a mobster.
Oh,
man.
Owner of a nightclub. I mean,
everybody that owns a nightclub
like an upstanding businessman to me.
Okay, he was killed by upstanding businessman Jack Ruby. So that was it. He was killed in 1963, assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. End of story.
Oh,
right?
Oh, that is far from the end of the story.
Yeah, that is the end of the story. I think this opens up a lot of. I mean, obviously, everybody, regardless of your age or what you know about the Kennedy assassination, everybody has heard some sort of conspiracy theory or theory about what actually happened to JFK that day, or how it happened, or who was involved in all of it. I don't think it's. I don't think you can go through life without hearing some sort of pitch as to how this actually happened. And normally it doesn't end with Lee Harvey Oswald killed JFK.
That's probably a fair statement.
Yeah, so there are a number of theories about what actually happened. And, the people, American people, were also kind of unsure about how this official story went out. Some people even thought that the vice president for JFK who assumed the